Good evening. For the second weekend in a row, thousands of Londoners marched through the streets demanding to be heard their message that Black Lives Matter. For the majority, the protests were peaceful, but today both the government and the mayor condemned violence by small numbers against the Metropolitan Police that left 35 officers with injuries. Statues were damaged too, with graffiti painted on Winston Churchill's memorial, as our correspondent Simon Harris reports.
Winston Churchill scrubbed up well today. The graffiti labelling him a racist was soon gone. But the vandalism and violence infuriated one of Churchill's biographers, Boris Johnson. The Prime Minister said the protests have been subverted by thuggery.
I was really shocked that he used that word. I didn't see anything thuggery going on. And if there was, I didn't see it. And if there was, it was definitely a minority of people.
There were small pockets of friction. This was Whitehall, where a flare was set off. Scotland Yard said 35 police officers were injured during Saturday and Sunday's protests. 2 of them were seriously hurt, including a woman police officer who fell from a horse after it bolted. And when police arrested a man on Vauxhall Bridge, they were surrounded by protesters shouting, "Let him go."
I need to say this quite simply. It is unacceptable for anybody to assault our police or to be violent towards our police. I've met police officers who run towards dangerous terrorists, encouraging others to run towards safety.
But on both days, the demonstrations were largely trouble-free, even if it did prove impossible to obey social distancing rules in a crowd.
It has been difficult, I can see, to observe social distancing, but people have been trying. Another place it's been difficult to observe social distancing is clearly on the beaches of the UK, where people have been out. So the idea that only protesters are causing an issue in terms of social distancing I think is completely unfair.
In the Commons, the Home Secretary condemned what she called a lawless minority.
This hooliganism is utterly indefensible. There is no justification for it. There is no excuse for pelting flares at brave officers, throwing bikes at police horses, attempting to disrespect the cenotaph, or vandalising the statue of Winston Churchill.
Would the Home Secretary agree with me that the best way to ensure that Black Lives Matter is peaceful protest, working on ways to improve social justice and improve economic opportunities for Black people and other ethnic minorities, not lawless, senseless violence?
But the anger wasn't confined to the Conservative benches.
Does the Home Secretary recognise that there's structural inequality, discrimination and racism in our country? Does the Home Secretary recognise that people want to see action from this government?
The slogans which defaced government buildings as well as statues have largely disappeared tonight. Ministers would like that to be true of the protests too, but it's unlikely. Simon Harris, ITV News.
Good evening. For more than 200 years, the statue of slave trader Robert Milligan has stood tall in the capital. It is now being removed after the mayor, Sadiq Khan, said all statues linked with slavery should be taken down. The decision was made after a week of anti-racism protests following the death of George Floyd in America. His funeral in Texas began an hour ago. At the same time, protesters gathered in Westminster. More on that in a moment. First, our political correspondent, Simon Harris, on London's uncomfortable relationship with parts of its history.
Robert Milligan was already hiding his head in shame. Now, more than 200 years after his statue was unveiled in London's Docklands, it's finally being taken down. The memorial honoured his role in the creation of West India Dock, but that was only part of his story.
It's very clear that he's being celebrated as a kind of giant of commercial endeavour and as a national figure. However, what's not made clear is that commerce was the slave trading, plantation ownership and West Indian goods produced by enslaved people.
Anti-racism campaigners have long campaigned for Milligan to be denied his prominent position in the East End. Etisham Hock, local councillor, started a petition to put pressure on the landowners, the Canal and River Trust, to move the statue into a nearby museum.
I do not condone vandalism and throwing the statue to River Thames. Well, what we are asking for is take it inside, and if you are truly sincere about the purpose of history, then do describe it in an objective manner.
It appears the toppling of Bristol slave trader Edward Colston has become a catalyst. London's mayor has instructed officials to look at all historic statues, murals and even street names to see if they can better reflect the capital's diversity.
We've got to realise that it's not on for us to commemorate or memorialise people who were involved in the slave trade, who were slavers, whether it's 200 years ago or 300 years ago. Just imagine what it's like as a black person to walk past a statue of somebody who enslaved your ancestors.
On the face of it, Thomas Guy was one of London's great benefactors. He paid for Guy's Hospital in Southwark, where his statue has pride of place. But part of his wealth came from shares in a company which sold slaves. Tonight, there are questions about his future. But Robert Milligan will be moving as soon as the engineers have done a risk assessment. Simon Harris, ITV News.
Good evening. There were winners and losers in the announcement made by the Prime Minister in the last hour on how lockdown restrictions will be eased further. London Zoo, who said yesterday they face the threat of permanent closure, can reopen from Monday. Churches can also open their doors for private prayer. But schools cannot welcome all pupils back before the autumn term, leaving some families in the capital and charities who work with them fearful about how they will feed and educate children for the next 3 months. More on that in a moment. First, our political correspondent Simon Harris on today's announcements.
Like an out-of-work actor, Banu the lion has got used to resting. He's had no choice. Since the end of March, there have been no crowds to entertain. But in Banu's case, the audience will soon be back. From Monday, London Zoo can reopen its doors to the public. And this latest relaxation of lockdown rules hasn't come a moment too soon.
We've got a lot of animals to feed and a lot of staff that need to keep caring for the animals during closure. So, yeah, we were rapidly running out of money. So this is not us getting out of the woods, but it is certainly helping us.
Big paw prints remind people to stay 2 metres apart. There are notices to try to keep the virus off glass windows and a one-way system around the enclosures. More than 1 million people come to the zoo every year. But there's one group of visitors which won't be back anytime soon: school parties. Although some primary schools are now teaching some pupils, the government concedes its target of opening all of them before the summer holidays won't be met.
It's because the rate of infection is not yet quite low enough, and because we're not able to change our social distancing advice, including smaller class sizes in schools, that we are not proceeding with our ambition to bring back all primary pupils, at least for some weeks, before the summer holidays.
Gyms are also still in lockdown, but at one at Park Royal in West London, the personal trainers were putting the COVID-secure workout areas through their paces. Around 300,000 Londoners belong to this chain, but for more than 10 weeks, they've been denied the physical and mental health benefits of a visit to the gym.
Exercise is a wonder drug, and that's something that we're very keen to start providing back to the British population.
How frustrating is it that McDonald's and IKEA and now zoos can open but you can't?
Well, look, of course, it is frustrating that some people have opened ahead of us, but we understand the government's got a difficult job to do.
White tape on the floor will help members stay 2 metres apart. Equipment will be wiped down with disinfectant. How safe is it going to be?
It's going to be very safe. I feel much safer in a gym than I do going out to like a supermarket, for instance.
But the government has yet to come up with official guidelines for gyms, and there is still no date for when they might reopen.
All right, Simon, so no gyms, but there was some good news today for single households.
Yes, the big winners from today are people who live alone. From Saturday, they'll be able to visit another household and even stay the night. The Prime Minister called this arrangement a support bubble, but you'll only be allowed to have one support bubble. So if you do live alone, you'll have to restrict your visits to just that one other household. Effectively, both households will be treated as one, and the normal 2 metre social distancing rule won't apply. The Prime Minister also said that churches, mosques, synagogues and temples can open their doors for individuals to pray, but not for people to gather for worship.
All right, Simon, thank you. From Monday, London will start to return to something like normal, with non-essential shops able to reopen. But the government's coming under pressure from the MPs and businesses to relax the 2-metre social distancing rule. Our political correspondent Simon Harris is here. And Simon, you've been talking to the leader of the opposition about this.
Yes, Lucrezia. There's no doubt that cutting the social distancing gap from 2 metres to 1 metre would have a big impact on how many people could go into a shop, how many people could get on a train or a bus, or how many children might be allowed into a classroom. Now, Sir Keir Starmer was elected Labour leader at the beginning of April, just after lockdown started, so the coronavirus outbreak has dominated politics for much of that time. When he spoke to us today, I asked him if he was a 2-metre person or a 1-metre person.
I am a follow the science and the advice person. At the moment, the science and the advice is 2 metres. I don't think whether we go from 2 metres to 1 metre is a political choice, it's a scientific choice, and the science says 2 metres at the moment.
Can you see the benefits of moving to 1 metre, particularly in a place like London?
Well, look, there are benefits and there's risks. If the risk is of greater infection, then that immediately puts a strain back on our NHS. It immediately could lead to further suffering and further deaths. And of course, it could also lead to a shutting down of the economy again. So it's in nobody's interest to take risks that could lead to a second spike.
You say you'll look at the science. What about the science that's guiding other European countries to 1 metre?
Well, there is different advice across different countries in Europe. We have been following the science in this country. I asked the Prime Minister for access to his scientific advisors. He's given me that access from time to time, so I do discuss this with them, and I'll discuss this with them next time I speak to them. But at the moment, I think politicians trying to simply come to a view isn't that helpful. We've got scientific advisors, let's talk it through with them, see what the risk is and balance up that risk according to the advice that's given.
So you have confidence in the government scientific advisors that you're talking to as well?
Well, I do have confidence. That's not to say, I mean, science isn't a fixed thing. Different scientists have different views. We have to weigh that up. But I have confidence in those that I'm listening to. Obviously, there's a judgment, evaluation, but I think it's important to see what they have to say before we come to a decision.
There's a lot of pressure on ministers, not just from Tory MPs, but also businesses, especially the hospitality sector. Transport for London says it'll be guided by the government. But just to give you one example, there's enough room on a normal tube train carriage for around 100 passengers. With social distancing of 2 metres, it's cut to just 14 passengers. If it was 1 metre, you could get 31 passengers into that carriage safely.
Yeah, significant difference there. Simon, thank you.